and take control of the screen. Okay. So chapter 5 is our topic for the evening. Due process procedures, for evaluation, development of IEPs, and placement. Certainly an important, collective of information for you all to be aware of. And by this point in time, we are all well aware of the fact that the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act provides a system of safeguards, procedural due process safeguards, to ensure that students in special education or that require special education related services are properly identified, evaluated, and then placed in educational settings in the least restrictive environment. And really the ultimate goal of these safeguards is to make parents and other legal guardians equal partners with school officials in the education of their children. Nothing new or groundbreaking. And so we do know that parent participation is explicitly required by IDEA, and so essentially these safeguards are requiring officials in school districts to work with parents in the development of IEPs, in the development of, or in the placement of their children, and also in the evaluation process. And again, we talked about this last week when we talked about parental rights, but states, through their local school boards or other agencies, are mandated to provide parents of students with disabilities opportunities to to participate in the development of their IEPs. Just a bit of review, so to speak. Before IDEA was in place, if you had a chance to read the chapter, you are well aware of the fact that parents weren't often active team members in the special education process. So this was not a federally mandated law. More often than not, school personnel or people within the districts just made decisions for the placement of students without even really considering students' wishes or that students' parents' wishes. And as the textbook talks about, these unilateral placement decisions, so decisions made by a small group of individuals without taking into consideration the wishes and desires of the larger team, specifically the wishes and desires of the people and the family members of those people who would be receiving these services, led to exclusion, especially for students who were difficult to educate. And this exclusion was from many school activities, opportunities to learn in the classroom alongside peers specifically. And so again, IDEA has changed the game in this regard, in that its regulations are ensuring that school officials, it is illegal for them to act without parental knowledge or informed parental consent prior to conducting evaluations or making initial placements. So this is a very big and important step in recognizing the need and the importance of collaboration between related service providers, classroom teachers, students with disabilities, and their parents or other legal guardians. And so we'll talk about a lot of kind of the nuances related to the topic for tonight. And one important caveat that the textbook highlights is that the IDEA specifies that parental consent for initial evaluations is not the same as consent for placement or consent for the receipt of special education and related services. So just because a parent consents to the evaluation process, this informed consent cannot be carried over to the steps that would come after that, namely the development of the IEP and the initiation of the special education services. So basically, parents are having, an important amount of say at all stages of the special education process. And again, we are well aware of the fact that educators are mandated. We are all mandated to provide parents with prior written notice whenever a proposed change is suggested or refused after making the original placement that was agreed upon by the team. And I think we covered this topic fairly substantially or very thoroughly last week when we talked about this. And the importance of this procedural compliance was emphasized legally in this court ruling that you see up on the screen. The Board of Education of the Hendrick Hudson Central School District versus Rowley. And in that hearing, one of the important precedents that were laid down, the legal precedents, was that an ed program is not appropriate unless it is developed according to the IDEA procedures. And there are a number of them. We've talked about a number of them. We have a number of them still to get through. So we'll jump right into the due process procedures for evaluation. And again, if you have any questions while I'm talking, feel free to jump in. So again, we're all aware of child fine, which is essentially the mandate or the IDE regulation that obligates states to develop and put into action different procedures that are going to ensure that all children with disabilities or suspected of having disabilities are identified and evaluated in a way that is proper. And we'll recall that proper evaluative procedures, include assessments conducted by a multidisciplinary team of educational service providers, teachers, in addition to information from parents that is relevant to a student's educational program. Following the initial identification of or evaluation and determination of a student as being qualified for receiving special education services, we know that IEPs must be reviewed annually and reevaluated at least once every 3 years during those triennial reviews, unless parents or other school officials agree that they are unnecessary. Or unless a parent requires or requests an evaluation to occur kind of before this mandated every 3-year reevaluation. So an important issue in special education, and an issue that we'll talk about a bit as you all progress in this program, specifically when we get to SPED 556, which is issues in special education, is the overrepresentation of minority students in special education. And so IDEA takes this fact into consideration and includes provisions that are intended to reduce this reality of overrepresentation of certain minority or ethnic groups in special education. I know the book chapter didn't talk too much about why we see this overrepresentation. Do you all have ideas, or have you encountered any literature on this topic? Why some students are overrepresented in special education? Specifically those not kind of in the, white kind of middle class, norm, so to speak?
It's because that English is not their first language.
Yep, yeah, we talked about it.
It appears to be like a communication disorder.
Right.
But they're not taking it into consideration. And it goes for the same for someone who's nonverbal on the terms of like having a cognitive disability.
Right.
So, I mean, they're different, but the same But this, I don't know.
Your socioeconomic too could come into play, especially if you don't have Head Start. So those readily available students could be behind before they even start school, and that's not, if it's a socioeconomic group, it wouldn't have anything to do with their actual learning intelligence.
Right, and that's speaking to bias in the test. You know, certainly a lot of intelligence tests, until recently, are normed on samples traditionally characterized by, you know, students who are mostly white and mostly coming from middle-class backgrounds. And so just because a certain cultural group, you know, many cultural groups don't share the same cultural values as that norming sample. And so when you give them a test, you know, that is not appropriate for their culture, and that takes into consideration kind of the culturally sanctioned behaviors characteristic of these minority groups, well, you know, you can get these differences based on test scores that aren't actually indicators of, you know, relative, you know, reduced amounts of intelligence. But we'll have a lot more to say about that next year, 2020, during this term. And so again, I already alluded to this. This provision is requiring the development of policies and procedures to prevent the over-identification or disproportionate representation by race and ethnicity of children with disabilities. And so certainly one of these provisions is that, you know, appropriate tests, assessments, and just evaluative procedures in general are used, and we don't, you know, make our recommendations based off of examples of the kind of assessments that I already discussed. Additionally, it obligates, you know, schools, states to aggregate data for minority groups who are in special education classes. Or sorry, that is disaggregated based on, you know, race, ethnicity, etc., to ensure that we're not seeing this issue of overrepresentation occurring. And certainly, with respect to long-term suspensions and expulsions of students with disabilities, IDEA directs educators to examine data, including information disaggregated by race and ethnicity, to make sure that, you know, we're not seeing kind of further overrepresentation in the context of suspensions this time. And if you go onto the U.S. Department of Education's website, when you look at the special education section, you can actually look at this data, and it's all available for free. And which I think is important, that there's this transparency. It encourages people who are interested in doing research to kind of look at these data sources in creative ways in attempts to kind of determine, you know, really what's going on with respect to this overrepresentation problem. We're all well aware of the fact that IDEA is mandating review and, if appropriate, revisions to the policies, procedures, and practices related to the implementation of IEPs. So the IEP is, you know, never really it's a living document, so to speak. You know, it's always open to change or revision when those become necessary, and they're agreed upon by the team as a whole. So, following the initial basically referral, either by a parent or a teacher of a student who is suspected of having a disability, once the student is evaluated, and if a disability is indeed present, well, basically IDE requires this is after the parental consent is informed to conduct the evaluation. I got ahead of myself. This needs to be done in 60 days or less. So about 2 months after the initial referral, and then the receipt of parental informed consent. And again, another fact that we're all well aware of is that different states have laws that are, you know, different from other states' laws. And so, this might mean that, in some states, evaluations are going to be required to be completed during summer vacations or other holiday periods if this 60-day, time frame ends during one of them. So this rule doesn't apply if a child's parent repeatedly fails or refuses to produce the child for evaluation. So, if a school district can, provide evidence of the fact that they've, taken all the efforts that were within their power to get a child, in for an evaluation, and a parent just repeatedly, failed to comply with those attempts, well, the 60-day rule would not apply. It's only in the context of, a referral being made and consent being received that the 60-day rule does apply. So if parents refuse to respond to requests to provide consent for initial evaluations or to services, educational officials may still continue with evaluations as long as they follow the procedures identified in the IDEA. So this is saying that there is kind of the ability of evaluations to be conducted, provided that they follow the rules set forth in the IDEA. The textbook draws or makes an important clarification. Generalized screenings or teacher developed tests that are used for instructional purposes to maybe see where a student kind of is in their reading ability at the beginning of the school year. Even if they do suggest a significant deficit in that area, they can't be used or they can't be considered evaluations for special education. These evaluations, again, as I've already mentioned, need to be completed by a multidisciplinary team of professionals. And again, we can never base a decision to provide a student with special education services based on the outcomes of a single assessment tool. We need to use a variety of tools and strategies that are going to produce the types of functional and developmental and academic information, including information from the parents that is relevant and that is focusing on all areas of a student's suspected disability. So this is a very comprehensive procedure, very formalized procedure. So sometimes parents may not agree with the evaluations, the results or the outcomes of evaluations that school districts complete, and parents certainly have the rights in those situations to seek out independent evaluations at public expense. So this is a definite possibility. Maybe a parent, maybe a student did not technically qualify for special education based on the outcomes of a district's evaluation, and a parent, is convinced that their child does indeed have a disability that would qualify them for special education services. Well, they have every right to go out there and seek that out on their own. If this independent evaluation is, just for gaining a second opinion or getting more information, well, in that situation, that's not going to be an evaluation that is conducted at public expense. There needs to be a formal disagreement, on paper in order for this whole process of reimbursement for an independent evaluation to be considered. So again, first and foremost, there needs to be this issue of disagreement between district and parents, and then there needs to be a challenge to the appropriateness of that school board assessment. And in the same way that parents can challenge the outcomes of a district's assessment, so too can districts challenge the outcomes of independent evaluations using due process hearings and attempting to demonstrate that their own evaluations meet the IDEA's requirements. So in the case that a school district is successful, they prevail in their argument that the evaluation that they conducted was appropriate, well, in that situation, a school district will not be on the hook for compensating a parent for that independent evaluation. Generally, the textbook talks about this kind of general rule that they derived based on the decisions produced by judges in a variety of different court cases, and that is that courts tend to order boards to reimburse parents for these independent evaluations when the parents can indeed prove that that disputed evaluation wasn't appropriate and that their independent evaluations were appropriate. So again, this is going to be a dispute that will require the expertise of a lawyer and possibly expert witnesses in the form of the individual who conducted the independent evaluation. This is not like a small claims court situation where a parent would be advised to take this matter into her or his own hands, unless of course that parent was a lawyer practicing special education law. And certainly parents are able to pursue independent evaluations without notifying school districts that that's what they're doing. But indeed, the textbook does talk about the fact that in failing to provide this prior notice and not being transparent in this regard, that they run a higher risk of their claims for reimbursement being jeopardized, particularly if it's preventing the school district or board representatives from requesting due process hearings and seeking to prove that their evaluations were indeed proper. So if this independent evaluation is being conducted kind of in secrecy, without a school district's knowledge, and for some reason it's delaying a due process hearing, well, this is something that might raise a red flag and get in the way of a parent or parents getting their independent evaluations reimbursed by the school districts. So in those cases, when these independent evaluations are requested, the burden of proof is generally on the school district or other educational officials to ask for hearings to demonstrate that their evaluations were appropriate or that the parental independent evaluation was inappropriate. If that is the district's position and they are contending this obligation to fund to reimburse the parents for that evaluation. And again, as long as a parent does seek out a valid independent evaluation, and basically a valid independent evaluation is going to be one that is in line with a district's assessment criteria, well, they must be taken into consideration. If a parent went to an energy healer and had that individual conduct an evaluation and tried to use that as evidence for the inappropriateness of a school district's evaluation, well, chances are that assessment, the outcomes of that evaluation would not be considered relevant because they're probably, well, not probably, they definitely are not going to be meeting the district's kind of rigorous assessment criteria. And any psychologist or psychiatrist, basically anyone who has experience in treating certain disabilities and diagnosing those disabilities, and as long as that individual has the proper credentials, then chances are that those are going to be considered assessments that are meeting the stringent requirements set forth by school districts. But again, this does not mean that these recommendations must be adopted. They just must be considered as long as they are considered valid in the eyes of the school district. And again, these evaluations need to be conducted by teams of specialists. It's a point that we will reiterate time and time again. This is kind of one of the very critical components of the IDEA, one of kind of the very foundational you know, provisions or regulations set forth therein. So there are other kind of unique situations that the textbook talks about in the context of evaluation. In those cases where a parent, removes their child from a placement that was initially agreed upon in the context of an IEP, the parent removes their child unilaterally and places that child in an out-of-state facility, for example. Well, in this situation, a school district would not be required to leave their state to evaluate that student. So this is kind of one caveat to this rule, or these kind of regulations surrounding evaluation. So just a quick overview of the steps in this evaluation and placement process. Before I get into them, are there any questions or anything? Any observations? Okay. Good, good. So we start with the referral. A student who is suspected of having a disability and being in need of special education. The student is referred for a possible evaluation. And again, these referrals need to be made by knowledgeable persons, most commonly the student's parents or the student's teacher. And again, there needs to be a formal notification. It can't just be kind of a passing comment in the hallway. There needs to be records of these notifications, and generally the best way of going about this is putting something in writing, putting a letter in the mail, or sending an email, depending on what is most convenient for the parents. And again, a school district needs to take every step necessary to ensure that these notices are in a form or a mode of communication that is appropriate for that child's parents. If it does need to be verbal, for example, if a student's parents can't read English and perhaps the district does not have a translator or somebody who is proficient in kind of the written communication, written form of the communication or the language that the parent seeks or speaks, these can't be verbal notifications. But again, the notice is going to need to include the reasons for the referral. And these reasons should be the specific behaviors that the student is displaying in the classroom would be kind of the first the most kind of fundamental sources of evidence that would need to be included in this section. After the notification is given, again, there needs to be consent to conduct evaluation requested of the parents. If parental consent is indeed obtained, well, there needs to be a formal schedule for the evaluation put into place. And again, as we just discussed, this will occur within the first 60 days after having received that parent's consent. And again, these evaluations are going to be multifactorial, meaning that they're going to be conducted by a variety of individuals with expertise in the specific areas that a student is suspected of having a disability in. Once the evaluation is complete, school officials will meet to discuss these results and then to make determinations or essentially final judgments as to whether a student is indeed going to receive or require SPED services or any other related services that the IDEA requires be provided to students in special education. We have the initial IEP team meeting in which the IEP is developed. And as we've discussed, one of the rights that parents entertain or enjoy due to the IDEA regulations that protect kind of their roles in this whole special education process. They can either accept or reject a proposed IEP. They can suggest, you know, alternative IEPs or alternative IEP goals, or they might even postpone the decision to implement an IEP in favor of seeking an independent evaluation for their child. So again, just because we've got this far in the process does not mean that a parent is going to be obligated to just accept the first proposed educational program that is developed for their child. In those cases where IEPs are accepted, well, they need to be implemented immediately, as soon as possible. No questions asked. In those cases where they're rejected, the IDEA's dispute resolution procedure is put into play, and then, you know, depending on when these disputes are resolved, it would be at that point in time that the IEP would be put into place. There's a minor caveat to this rule as well that we'll discuss in a few more slides. And that's basically that in these cases where these disputes are lengthy, a school district does have the right to put into place an interim IEP while the more permanent IEP is being developed. So students certainly shouldn't be going completely without special education services in this situation. And lastly, and very importantly, as I mentioned, IEPs are essentially living documents, and they should be, you know, reviewed annually based on IDEA's requirements, and reevaluation should occur every 3 years. And I've already mentioned the fact that, in addition, parents have the right to request evaluations or reevaluations sooner than every 3 years, if there is a valid reason for doing so. So just a quick overview of the steps in the evaluation and placement process. We'll go into the development of IEPs next. Before we jump into that material, any questions, observations, needs for clarification? Nope, okay. Well, then let us continue onward. Okay, developing IEPs. The IDE provides a nice definition of what an IEP is, and that is a written statement for each child with a disability that is developed, reviewed, and revised in accordance with the IDEA's dictates. So you are all well aware of the fact that IEPs must be structured in a certain way. They must include very specific components, and these very specific components and these structures for writing IEPs are all mandated by the IDEA. We have 7 major elements of IEPs. First of all, an IEP is going to need to include some statement about a student's current level of academic achievement and functional performance. This is essentially like the baseline, as it were. What can this student do now, kind of in this area that is affected by the disability? So this is going to kind of inform, the, how do I put it? The breadth of the goal and what that goal should be targeting. Annual goals must be measurable, and they must be targeting academic and functional domains. And we'll talk a bit about what makes a goal measurable in a couple slides. There need to be descriptions of how data is going to be collected and how progress toward these goals will be measured. That's essentially the data that I just mentioned. And when these kind of periodic reports are going to be provided. In addition to statements of the services along with any other kinds of aids or related services that the child is going to be requiring in order to make progress toward their goals. And in all situations, ideally, these supplementary aids, services, accommodations or classroom modifications should be should have been proven effective in the context of peer-reviewed research. This is another issue that we'll talk about in SPED 556, and it's referred to as the research to practice gap. It often is the case that there might be evidence-based practices kind of sitting out there in the research literature, but they are not always introduced. They're not always easily accessible to teachers. I did provide you all with an example or the name of that website, the What Works Clearinghouse, which actually is an effort that came out of this research to practice issue. And that basically the gap that this website is intending to fill is to give teachers and other service providers easy access to research-based practices that they can use to support their students in the classroom. Statements specifying the services and aids and services that the children will receive. If a student is going to be excluded from the regular education classroom for some amount of time or for all of the time, well, there needs to be an explanation for why this will be the case. Detailed information that is going to be discussing the individualized or individual appropriate accommodations that are going to be necessary to measure the academic achievement and functional performance of students on state and district assessments. The projected date of initiation and duration of special education services that the children are to receive. And there's well, the textbook does talk about the kind of 7 major elements. There is also a section that talks about this 8th important component, and that is the transition component in the form of the individualized transition plan that should be put into place in the first IEP after the child turns 16. So again, this is going to be focusing on appropriate, measurable post-secondary education goals. So focusing on making the transition to college or to employment, to accessing resources in the community, whatever an individual student's specific goals are, kind of after high school. And again, this is going to be updated annually. It's going to need to include the transition services that will be put into place to help students to achieve these post-secondary goals. Also, there's a requirement that at least 1 year before a child reaches the age of majority, so before they turn 18, that they're provided with notice of the rights that will transfer to them once they do indeed reach that age of maturity. So we talked about a number of these rights last week. So one of them is the right to access their educational records. Technically, a student would be allowed to sign off on her or his IEP once they reach the age of majority, provided that they're not conserved or their disability is so severe that by signing off on an IEP, they would be doing so as quote unquote an uninformed party. So the idea of a measurable versus a non-measurable goal is certainly an important element of an IEP. And generally, the language that we use when writing or producing IEP goals is what is going to dictate whether or not a goal is indeed a measurable one or if it's a non-measurable one. And so what I would like for us to do is to consider different terms that are going to be referring to kind of, how we would be, collecting data, or what kind of observations would be helping us to support, whether or not a student is making progress toward reaching his goals. And so once we see a term, I was just going to ask you if this term were included in an IEP goal, would it make that goal measurable, or would that goal be non-measurable? So we'll start off with an easy one. Let's say we have an IEP goal that's going to require a student to point to something. Would this goal be easily measurable, or would it be non-measurable?
Measurable.
Yeah, you can make it measurable.
Right, because what is it? It's very easy to see a child do what?
Point at something.
Point to something. It's very
easy to identify how many times they're pointing at it.
Right. There's no kind of, room for vagueness, or the language is very clear and objective. In 6 out of 10 occasions, Billy is going to be able to point to, X, Y, or Z. How about grasp the meaning of?
Non-measurable.
Non-measurable. Yeah, right. What does that mean? Grasp the meaning of?
Meaning of what?
Right. I mean, yeah, even if we specified, a kind of a target here, grasp the meaning of
like he's actually holding on to it, or he's actually understanding it.
Right.
Yeah.
So certainly we would want to think about language that is more specific than grasp the meaning of. Okay, next one. Enjoy.
Non-measurable.
Non-measurable. How could we, let's say we wanted to have a goal that is like, targeting a student's level of enjoyment. Can anyone think of a way that we could frame that type of goal in terms that are measurable?
Maybe how many times he smiles, or maybe laughs, or
right.
participates.
Right, you would want to have some indicator of enjoyment that is easily observable, right?
And every student's going to be a little bit different.
Right.
Indicator is.
You could have him self-report on whether or not he enjoyed the activity.
Good. Or maybe an indirect indicator of enjoyment might be, the student requesting to do a particular activity, right? We could maybe argue that is a sign of the student, enjoying that activity because she or he is requesting to participate in it. To state something. Non-measurable. Why is that?
Because what are they stating? It needs to have a little bit more to it. Are they
Billy, in 6 out of 10 occasions, Billy will state his desire for lunch given 2 options.
Yeah.
That seems like it would be measurable, right?
Yeah.
So certainly, yeah. I mean, these are, decontextualized. It's difficult to determine whether or not some of these goals would be measurable. Counting.
Measurable.
Very measurable. Very easy to see a student count something and to, determine how accurate, on how many numbers of occasions the student was accurate. Understand? In 7 out of 10 occasions, Billy will demonstrate an understanding of the jokes told by his peers.
That would be measurable.
Becca, what do you think? I saw you giving us a big thumbs down.
Yeah, sorry, I had myself muted. How do you know they understand? What are they going to do to prove they understand? That would make a better goal than just understand.
Right. Certainly, a student could maybe learn through kind of environmental cues when a joke is being told. Maybe the kid just laughs when everyone else laughs, which would, on the surface seem like it was evidence of the understanding of humor, but we don't really know whether or not that kid really and truly does understand, the joke.
In the right moment.
What's that?
Have to be like in the right moment when you're measuring it.
Right.
Like they're not just laughing the whole time.
Right. Or maybe we would want to include a component to that type of goal that, I don't know, maybe required some some probing, as it were. Well, what was funny about that joke, right? What is it about the situation in which the joke was told that made it funny, right? We would want to kind of probe into the child's level of understanding in a deeper way. To participate in an activity, is that measurable or non-measurable?
I would say it would be measurable.
Seems pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah.
We can see a kid, participate in a basketball game with his friends. We can see somebody participate in any number of activities.
Yeah, in a social group or
participate in a discussion, for example. Read orally, again, measurable or non-measurable?
Measurable.
Very measurable, right? We can give a student a reading passage and ask her to read that passage out loud, and we can count how many words she got correct versus incorrect in terms of her ability to pronounce them, and have a very kind of objective measure of that student's reading ability in the context of that reading passage. To be familiar with.
Too vague.
Very vague, right?
Yeah.
On 7 out of 10 occasions, Billy will be familiar with different options for employment once he graduates high school, right? That's something that's like, what does familiar with mean?
It should
Does this mean that the kid could just name 7 different potential jobs? Like, does it mean that the kid should be able to also identify different tasks associated with those 7 different jobs? So again, as it stands there, just the language is too vague to be used in a goal that is actually measurable in the sense that the IDEA requires IEP goals to be. So I would just go through a few of the kind of common IEP development pitfalls. And again, we talked about this one, goals that are not measurable. We also touched on this pitfall, goals that are vague. Goals that are not focused on skills. And again, not just any skills, but these skills should be, in the academic area, maybe linked to kind of the academic standards, set forth for that in that kid's grade level for general education students. Repeating the same goal even though no progress is seen. We should never continually repeat the same goal over and over again, because the kid isn't making progress toward reaching that goal. Instead, we should do what? We shouldn't just repeat the same goal, but we should think about doing what in that situation.
Maybe change the expectation.
Change the expectation, exactly. Maybe the goal is too lofty. Maybe we need to, really think about, well, what are the kind of the sub-components of this goal, the stepping stones, as it were, and start targeting some of those more kind of ground level or foundational behaviors or abilities that a student needs to master on their way towards meeting kind of the ultimate goal. So lack of connection or connectivity between a student's present level of performance, their IEP goals, the accommodations and modifications that and services that are required to help that student meet that goal, right? They should all be kind of related. We shouldn't have a goal that, has nothing to do with that student's present level of performance, or a goal that is, too lofty based on that student's present level of performance. The accommodations, modifications, services need to be relevant. They need to, you need to be able to demonstrate clearly that these, these services are actually going to be useful toward the end of helping a student to reach his IEP goals. So lastly, just a quick summary for developing measurable goals. We always want to make sure that these goals are in proper alignment with a student's current level of performance. It should be a logical kind of next step or logical progression from where the student currently is and where we would like to see that student end up down the road. Again, there must be established this very clear relationship between the needs of the student, that student's annual goals, and the services that are going to help that student to overcome whatever her or his needs and meet the objectives or the annual goals that are set forth. And again, I alluded to this already. Be sure that the amount of progress that is projected in the goal is reasonable, right? We don't want to, just because a student knows how to do math or addition, we're not going to set a goal that the student is going to learn to do algebra, and by the end of the school year. We need to think about what are the kind of logical progressions in the development of the functional or academic skill. And knowing those, then taking into consideration how competent the student is at the time that the present level of performance is determined. And again, we never want to just repeat the same goal year after year. Doing so is evidence that either A, the goal is inappropriate, or B, maybe the accommodation or the modification in the classroom or the related service that we thought would be effective actually is not effective in helping the student to achieve this goal. So we need to go back to the drawing board, so to speak. And again, we've already emphasized this. We need observable behaviors in our IEP goals and the specific criterion against which these behaviors are going to be assessed. We actually need to measure the student's progress toward the goal. And we need to have supporting documentation that shows that we have indeed been collecting this data. We should never just rely on intuition. Yeah, it feels like Billy, is able to do that most of the time, so I'm going to say, yeah, he's achieved his goal. No, these need to be decisions based on objective sources of information, data collected on the student's ability to perform in the academic or functional domain. Use the progress data that has been collected to update present levels of performance when we do review and retool IEPs. Remember, even a measurable goal that is not measured is 100% useless. So just a little phrase of speech to help really drive home the importance of having measurable goals and then actually implementing the procedures for performing these measurements in the context of showing academic progress for students in special education. Okay, so I want to next talk about the idea of present levels of performance statement pitfalls, and specifically talk about this idea of strength-based IEP goals and present levels of performance. But the discussion will take a few minutes, so I'm going to propose that we take our break a bit early, and then we'll jump back into it at about 6 minutes after 6. Oh wait, sorry, so we're at 5:56 now. Let's be back at 6:04. No, 6:06, excuse me. Yes, I was right the first time. So 6:06, I will see you all back here, and we'll talk about strength-based IEP goals and present levels of performance statements. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Oh, what do I do? Okay. So one trend in the development of IEP goals is what is referred to as strength-based IEPs. And I think the name does a pretty adequate job of communicating what this type of IEP goal should be focusing on. What I would like to do is just give you two examples of present levels of performance statements, and we'll consider the differences between them. And it should be pretty obvious which is an example of a strength-based IEP goal or present level of performance in this case, and what is an example of a PLP that is actually the opposite of that. So we'll start with an example that I think is pretty common, and we'll be thinking about Franklin here. Franklin is a second grade student with ADHD and ID. He often has difficulty staying on task and focused. He also has a hard time comprehending and recalling material. Currently, he's on grade level for math, but is well below grade level in reading. Specifically, he has a hard time comprehending and recalling information read from a text. Because of these difficulties, Franklin is often unable to recall information from both independent reading books and books read aloud. So certainly this example communicates some important information, but it also leaves out a lot of important information that we would want to see included in an example of a strength-based PLP. So we'll contrast it with this example. Franklin is a friendly young boy who enjoys trains and tall buildings. He is timid in new situations, but warms up to people quickly. He is a hardworking second grade student who enjoys attending school, working with his teachers, and developing relationships with his peers. He enjoys and excels in math. During math instruction, he likes to use manipulatives when working to solve a given problem. Currently, he is working at mastering double-digit addition problems. When given 10 double-digit addition problems, he gets an average of 6 correct. However, when provided assistance, for example, the teacher drawing a line between the two-digit number, he is able to solve them correctly most of the time, as long as there are no carryovers. He has labels of ID and ADHD that affect him academically because it is more difficult for him to comprehend and remember material. And his label of ADHD makes it harder for him to stay on task and focus for the duration of a lesson. These challenges are often evident during reading instruction. Specifically, he often has difficulty recalling information from both independent reading books, or from independent reading books at the first grade level, excuse me. For example, when he's prompted by saying, "Did blank happen in the story?" He often guesses, and it's unclear if he comprehended what occurred in the story. However, when Franklin is given a graphic organizer to write down key aspects of the story and a peer buddy, he's able to more easily recall and pull out relevant textual information. Further, when these supports are paired with a text of his choice, he is able to pull out key elements and details of the text with little assistance, and he's able to recall information from the text more consistently. Those are two very different types of statements, PLP statements. Obviously, the second one is much longer, but here's some questions that I would like us to think about. What significant differences in language and student support did you notice between each of these PLPs?
The first one is much more negative.
Good. Is that Mara? Yes. Amara. Yeah. It only focuses on Franklin's deficits, right? His challenges. It does not include any of his skills, anything that he's good at, right?
The second one identified tools that would help him understand it, and yeah, basically tools, where the first
Right.
one isn't.
So provide some evidence of accommodations or strategies that have worked in the past to help Franklin be successful. The first statement does not provide anything along those lines. There's another big difference too.
There's an example used in the second one.
There are examples that help contextualize the challenges that Franklin experiences. Good. How about data? Did that first example include any data to support these statements of deficit that Franklin experiences?
No.
No. There's no baseline provided in that second statement, or in that first statement, excuse me. So let's say Franklin was coming into your class. Do you think reading one versus the other of these PLPs would give you expectations of what Franklin could do?
The first one, I would think that Franklin is lower than he is.
Right, because it doesn't talk about anything that he can do, on his own, or when, for example, when reading material is in line with the topics that he is interested in, like tall buildings or trains, for example.
Yeah. The other thing too is not knowing his level of independence.
Right.
So I'd be more apt to help where he probably could do it himself.
Right. So you don't have a good idea of like when it would be necessary for you to step in, because you don't even know to begin with what he's able to do on his own. And so we actually already addressed number 3. How would your understanding of Franklin based on one versus the other of these PLPs affect how you would approach teaching him? So I think we covered kind of the main point here is that, well, we wouldn't really know kind of when it would be appropriate, or at what stage, or in what kind of problem context we would need to step in and provide him with the support. Do you think these different approaches could have an effect on Franklin's life or his family's expectations for Franklin? In what way?
He can do more in the second one. And they would have more expectations for him.
Right. It's very clear that he does have, abilities in math and abilities in reading comprehension. But it's just a matter of knowing what is the most, functional or effective way of providing him with the accommodations that he needs in order to demonstrate his abilities. So which of these PLPs is most representative of what you see and where you work?
The first one.
The first one?
Although I just went to a full day training about making it look more like the second one.
Right. And so I know that most schools or districts have like a software that they use to develop, to develop IEPs, which kind of limits, it's not just a kind of a free-form narrative where you just get to write whatever you want. There's like specific things that cells that you have to populate. Is that true? Or do some of you just get kind of like free reign just to create a PLP narrative?
We have to populate.
Right.
Free range.
Okay, so there's a variety. Okay. Yeah, so certainly, the limitations can be imposed just by virtue of the, particular software or program that a school district uses to develop these goals.
And since I'm doing secondary, I'm getting IEPs written by a person who's very meticulous. So the ones I've gotten are very well written.
Oh, good. So they're kind of falling more in line with that second example.
Yeah.
Excellent. And so this should be a pretty obvious answer to this question, which is going to be considered best practice here.
Number 2.
Second one, yes. Definitely. So just a very quick introduction to the concept of a strength-based present level of performance statement. So certainly, this is we are shifting from a deficit model of special education to a call it an ability model, and this approach is staying consistent with kind of this general trend. So moving forward, just very quickly, we're all familiar with the members of IEP teams, and certainly these members, all of these people should be involved and are going to require involvement if we really want to get a holistic and very human, picture of a student. So certainly we want, parents or one of a child's parents to be involved in the development of IEP goals. At least one of a student's regular education teachers, if that student is in regular education or will be participating in regular education. At least one special education teacher or some other special education provider, if appropriate. Somebody from the school district who is qualified to provide or supervise the delivery of special education services, and somebody who is knowledgeable about general education as well, and also of importance, somebody who is knowledgeable of the school district's resources. Right? We need to, this is the person that's kind of going to be the reality check and is going to be able to speak to whether or not, certain accommodations or modifications or instructional approaches are actually going to be feasible given a school district's resources. And lastly, in addition, this person needs to be familiar with evaluation procedures. So this is going to be basically somebody kind of high up in the special education hierarchy, whether that be a superintendent, for example, or the director of special education, if feasible. Some kind of professional who can, basically talk about the results of the evaluation and the implications in the context of instruction that these evaluation results have on the student. And then other individuals at the discretion of either the student's parents or other school district personnel who are knowledgeable about the student or have special expertise concerning the students at issue. So once a child turns 16, this might be a voc rehab counselor, for example. So somebody who's familiar with the kind of the supports and services in the community that are available to students with disabilities as they make their transition out of the school system and into adulthood. This could be, somebody from the disability service provider's office at a community college or university, if feasible. So somebody who's kind of familiar with, the procedure by which a student would need to go through to basically, advocate for the accommodations that she or he might require in the classroom. And lastly, when appropriate, the child. In your IEPs, is the student generally present?
Not always.
Not always. In what cases is the student not present?
Usually, in my experience, since I'm working with 3rd through 5th graders,
Yeah.
usually the only kids that sit in on their meetings and this is while they can focus, maybe 10 minutes,
Right.
are the 5th graders.
Okay. So yeah, certainly children who are younger are going to have a harder time sitting in for the entirety of an IEP meeting or, contributing to that meeting. And maybe people, older students who are more severely impacted, again, they might not be present to the full extent. But ideally, we want, to create opportunities for children to be involved in their IEPs and to contribute to them. And these opportunities are going to look different for all students. So a highly kind of individualized, basically, what's the word I'm looking for? An individualized participation component
The only time I haven't had kids in a meeting is when it might be, we really need to talk about like a severe disability or something, and we didn't want them to have a negative thought of themselves.
Okay.
Other than that, all my kids, even 3rd through now high school, have always been in their meetings.
Okay. And they participate when they can?
Yes.
Right. And so, participation in IEP meetings is also like an important activity to promote self-determination. If you look at, research literature on evidence-based practices for teaching self-determination skills, certainly student-led IEPs when possible, or just participation to the extent that a kid can participate are examples of those evidence-based practices. And just real quick, I like this slide because it kind of gives a very broad overview of the entire IEP process, from pre-IEP to implementation to kind of the ongoing monitoring thereof, and really, highlights the importance of collaboration between individuals on the IEP team. Another factor, or another kind of strategy that's mentioned in this slide that I know that there's variation in terms of whether or not it occurs, is this idea of person-centered planning. So do you all meet with parents prior to the IEP meetings, or is it mostly the case that a kind of a draft IEP is developed and then parents come in after the fact?
Yes.
Do you get information from the parent? Maybe not in the context of like a formal face-to-face meeting, but reach out to the parent to see what that individual's desires might be or wishes might be for their student?
We do that at our IEP meeting.
Yeah.
Okay.
From the parents.
Right. So that's very common. That's like the common approach to the 2nd year cohort as well. But certainly, it's very important to, if possible, get parents kind of involved in this pre-IEP period. But again, that's going to be a function of, time, availability, and resources. Not all parents are going to be, free to participate in a pre-IEP person-centered planning meeting. So anyway, let's keep moving on here. So regarding contested IEPs, or cases in which IEPs have been brought to the courts, in general, any IEP that has resulted in a lack of parental participation due to the exclusion of required IEP team members, which results in inadequacies in the IEPs, will tend to be invalidated by courts. And the textbook provides a lot of examples of different cases in which this was the case. But if members are missing from an IEP team, I've provided that list a few slides ago. It isn't necessarily the case that a court will overturn an IEP if one of these individuals is missing. And there are certain situations in which it's okay, for example, for one of those members to not be present. One example is, if the IEP is not going to involve any mainstreaming or time spent in the general education classroom, well, then it might not be as important for a general education teacher to be present at that student's IEP meeting. Basically, the team membership is going to be a function of what is going to be the proposed placement and what are that student's academic and functional goals, and what alternative services might that student require to meet those goals. And so the law is that these initial IEP meetings must take place within a month after the evaluation is complete and a student is determined to qualify for special education services. So it's important to be mindful of that timeline. And again, just to reiterate the importance of parental participation, one of IDEA's unique features is that it provides these safeguards that ensure a parent is going to get the opportunity to participate in the development of their child's educational program. And so at every stage, we need to ensure that we're taking all steps necessary or that are, realistically feasible to ensure this. And this is a very serious and very fundamental violation of the IDEA to not include parents on teams or to do things like hold IEP meetings without, telling a parent that one is going to be held. And I would assume that, in your experiences, you have experienced parental participation to the fullest extent possible, because I think this is kind of one facet of the IDEA that has been really ingrained in our practices and procedures in this area. And again, parents must be given the opportunity for genuine involvement. They can't be token opportunities. You can't just have a conversation with a parent in the hallway and discuss, whether or not they agree with a particular IEP goal, and have that discussion be, evidence in support of the fact that a parent was provided the opportunity to participate. Participation needs to be much more comprehensive than that situation. So there's always the case that maybe parents might refuse to participate in discussions regarding changes to IEPs. They fail to respond to multiple attempts to schedule meetings. Maybe their behavior becomes an impediment to the completion of IEP, the successful completion of IEP meetings. Well, this could present a different story. In these situations, a court might not rule in favor of the parent, just because if you have evidence of these challenges in any of these categories, you can make a good case for the fact that you did indeed do all that you could to support a parent's involvement. And again, just inviting teachers to IEP meetings does not fulfill IDEA's obligation. They need to be active participants to the extent possible. So there needs to be effort made to, find times that work for the entire team, for example. Just simply extending an invitation will not be enough in all cases. Failing to include knowledgeable school board representatives on an IEP team can also be a major detriment to a recommended program. Specifically, if the omission of this individual, for example, denies parents with the opportunity to, be fully informed as to what the available resources for their children are. In the context of transition, for example, never including, a vocational rehabilitation counselor who would have a good command over the available resources and that student's abilities. Once she or he exits the school system, would be an example of this. And again, IEPs don't have to be perfect, but as long as the flaws, if they're present, they do not seriously compromise the appropriateness of the program that is laid out therein. Well, these types of IEPs won't necessarily be invalidated by courts, were they, in those cases that they were brought in for trial. But in those cases where IEPs are missing very important elements, there have been a very clear pattern of decisions made by a variety of courts in which such examples have been nullified. If an IEP is too general, if an IEP is limited in the sense that it doesn't, address all of the areas of a student's disability, if an IEP doesn't delineate the specific services that will be provided by the district to address those areas. This is an example of an IEP that is missing an important element. Again, IEPs that are rife with vague language or information that does not, establish a student's need with precision. This is another situation in which, IEPs have been nullified by courts in the past. IEPs that are not individualized to the student's, needs and present levels of performance. We can't just use general information about, a disability category that a student is being that has been diagnosed as having. We need to take that information in consideration with the unique aspects of a student's situation. The textbook also takes a bit of time to discuss this important aspect of the IDEA, and that's that placement should be rooted in a student's IEPs and not the other way around. So for example, we should be developing placements to fit the unique individual needs of students. We should be doing that, excuse me. We should be developing placements that fit the unique individual needs of students rather than fitting children into available programs. Certainly this could be a challenge in, small rural communities that don't have the range of potential programs that larger, urban areas might have at their disposal. So we need to do our best to make sure that we're, not just kind of plugging students in to programs that aren't, entirely appropriate to them. So again, the textbook talks about instances in which IEPs that were written based on what placements offer as opposed to what the specific needs of a child are have been invalidated. So this is a kind of a very kind of unanimous, or there's not a lot of room for, for argument here. So for example, we should never be basically putting a child in a setting and then writing the IEP to carry out that decision after the fact. We always need to do our best to, first of all, determine what the students, what is going to be the least restrictive environment for the student, and then seek out a program or a placement that is most appropriate given the conclusions that we've reached during that process of evaluation. Putting a kid in a program before ever performing the evaluation or writing an IEP is also a big no-no. The courts have been very clear, and the decisions have been pretty unanimous in that in those situations where this has occurred and it's reached, the upper levels of court systems, that these IEPs are invalidated often. But again, just because we might have a placement in mind doesn't necessarily mean that we can't put that into the IEP and frame it in terms of a draft IEP and use it to inform discussion with IEP team members. I think we've already talked about this point, the development of IEPs beforehand and then forcing them on to parents without meaningful discussion of the educational needs of their children is a big no-no. And again, with respect to the idea of a draft IEP, certainly, school district IEP team members can't finalize placement decisions before IEP meetings, but that doesn't mean that they should be thinking about them prior to the meetings. So it's definitely okay to, have a few, examples of different placements that may be appropriate, in your back pocket when you come to these meetings. But this should never be framed in terms of them being kind of the finalized placement decisions. And I talked about this briefly. In those cases where, an IEP is not fully agreed upon by an entire IEP team, it is okay to have an interim IEP that's covering a short period of time while preparing a more appropriate placement or a more appropriate IEP. And these might occur in a few different situations as exemplified in the textbook. One example is that, maybe a student is going to require further evaluations, but it is clear that the student does require special education services. So in these cases, it would be okay for a student to be served by an IEP that, isn't the final one, so to speak. If a student moves from one school district to another, and this new district is not able to implement the student's previous IEP to the, immediately, well, it's okay to have an interim IEP in place while the necessary steps are taken to, implement that student's previous IEP. There is a bit of difference with respect to whether or not we're talking about a within state transfer or between state transfers. In the case of the former, within state transfers, school districts are required to provide services that are comparable to those in the student's previous IEPs until such time as the district adopts the previous IEP or develops a new one. In the case of between state transfers, again, the same rule applies. The new school district is required to provide services that are comparable to those offered in the previous state IEP until such a time as the district is able to decide whether or not it might be necessary to conduct further evaluations, develop new IEPs. We talked about this again regarding the revision of IEPs, at least annually, reevaluations every 3 years, and more frequently if they are needed. They should always be reviewed if a parent expresses a level of dissatisfaction with the educational program that was developed for their child. But there's a limit to the number of times that a school district must review an IEP. And the textbook talks about a case in which parents kind of continually demanded reevaluations and reviews of their child's IEP. And in this example, the court sided with the school district, the argument being that previous meetings addressed all the issues raised by the parents and were discussed, and those issues were discussed and investigated. So provided that this evidence can be used to support the fact that further reviews or reevaluations are not necessary because the district kind of did its due diligence in addressing a parent's issues. Those are situations in which it would be okay to not take that parent's further demands for reevaluation into consideration. And lastly, if a child is going to be moved from one placement to another, it may be necessary to develop a brand new IEP, but not always. So a number of caveats here in the area of developing IEPs. So now we'll jump into the due process procedures related to changes in placement. And we'll get out of here, hopefully on time. And again, a pretty basically understood regulation of IDEA. After the initial evaluation and the initial agreement on a placement recommendation, these cannot be changed unless parents are notified in writing or planned actions about planned actions and have been afforded opportunities to contest the proposed modifications. So we can't just all agree upon a placement and then very quickly, change that placement without first providing the parent with the information that they need to make an informed decision as to whether or not that change in placement will be appropriate for their child. In those cases where litigation is underway, the IDEA does dictate that students should remain in their then current placements while these decisions are being reached, unless parents and school district personnel agree otherwise. And so this is known as the status quo, or more frequently the stay put provision of the IDEA. And the then current placement is generally considered to be the educational setting that the student is actually in when these legal actions arise. So, even if this placement, is not the most appropriate one, chances are courts will mandate that a student remain in that placement until a decision is reached as to what will be the most appropriate action to take. Another caveat, there are many of them. If a proposed placement was never implemented, well, then that placement can obviously not qualify as the then current placement. I think that's pretty straightforward. If parents make unilateral decisions to put their students or their children in different educational settings, well, these can be considered then current placements if the school district fails to propose appropriate programs in a timely fashion. If a parent unilaterally removes their child from a program, well, then those settings do not stop being the then current placement. So it very well could be the case that a student would have to go back to that placement, even if the student's parents already removed the student from that placement. Chances are they would have to go back to that placement until the court made a decision. In those cases where placement in a private school, for example, is being contested, parents are certainly able to be reimbursed, just as long as the courts agree that that placement in the private school is indeed the then current placement. And essentially, to effectuate any changes in placement during review proceedings, for example, there needs to be agreement reached by a school district and that student's parents. And so that's really the only way that a student is going to be able to change placements kind of while these review proceedings are underway.
Would a school district choose to do that because it's cheaper to put, like if they can't provide the right environmental, if the child's, let's say, either highly aggressive or highly something they don't have, then it would be less expensive for them to place the student in a private school? Is that why they would do it?
So let me just paraphrase. So might a school district want to pull a student from a private school placement because it's cheaper to serve that student kind of within their own public schools system? Is that what you were asking?
Or the opposite? Like, why would they put them in a private school? Why wouldn't they try at all costs? Is that because of cost effectiveness, most likely?
Yeah, really the bottom line, I think, in a lot of these cases is money. And so, yeah, I don't know. The textbook didn't talk a lot about school districts, placing students in private schools. Mostly they talk about parents pulling their children out of public schools and placing them in private schools. And in those situations, I think, it's going to cost the district more money to serve that student in the private school because they'll have to be providing the SPED services and possibly paying the tuition for that student.
If there's less students in a private school versus public school, it could be beneficial for that student's education.
Absolutely.
Because private schools typically have a lot smaller classrooms.
Smaller ratios.
Yeah.
I guess, smaller ratios.
So they might be able to go to the classroom more often.
Right. So yeah, it's all a function of, what is the best placement and what is the cost of the services, required in that placement to support the student's academic development. So moving on, just a quick overview of the steps required to making a change in placement. So again, there needs to be a written notice provided in a reasonable amount of time prior to the change of placement. You can't just send a written notice indicating that, a child is going to be moved to a different placement the following day. There needs to be a sufficient amount of time that allows the parents to make an informed decision. And there are certain features or pieces of information that such notices must include. So a parent's going to need to be informed of basically the due process safeguards provided by IDEA that protect their rights, a description of the proposed change, also descriptions of the other options that were considered, and why, and explanations as to why those other options were rejected. So it's not enough just to say, here's where we want, here's where we think your child will, be most appropriately served. We need to provide examples of other potential options that we considered, and then pieces of evidence that support why these other options were less appropriate and therefore rejected by the school district. We need to provide explanations of all the assessments used to make these determinations. So there needs to be some data that is informing this argument for the change in placement. Any other relevant factors that were used in making these determinations, these must also be completed in or included in these notices. And again, if there's objection on part of parents, well, then they are entitled to IDEA's due process safeguards. They would have to basically follow those steps. And these vary depending on, they vary from state to state, excuse me. In some states, a student, this objection might be taken directly, to the courts for a hearing, or in some other states, they have mediations with hearing officers, and these are kind of a precursor to taking the situation or the case to higher levels of the court system. And if an agreement can be reached, at this mediation stage, well, it's certainly ideal, because it's going to be, much cheaper for a school district, and it's going to take less time. But in those cases in which placement is contested and it makes the case makes its way into the court system, again, a student will remain in their then current educational placement unless there's an agreement that a different placement is appropriate for the student. And the agreement needs to be between the school district and parents. It can't be a unilateral decision. If appeals are, if a student is seeking initial admissions to public schools, so the student didn't have a placement prior to the contestation of the placement being taken to the courts, well, then a student will just be placed in the public school program until all of the appeals and the hearings are completed. And in those cases where students whose districts have yet to place them in any kind of educational setting, well, they are not protected by the status quo provision. So these are the situations in which a school district would have the right just to put the kid in the public school program until a decision or agreement is reached between the parents and the school district, or a judgment is passed by the courts. Another situation in which this is a valid caveat is if a student was just unilaterally placed in a program by his parents before the school district had the opportunity to make a recommendation regarding his education. So in that situation, a student could be actually taken from that placement and put in the public school system, because the school district didn't have the opportunity to provide any say based on their evaluations and recommendations. Just kind of a few general points of agreement with respect to court decisions. The term change in placement refers to a change that affects the form of educational instruction provided, not necessarily the location where it takes place. So if a classroom or a program is being transferred from one location to another, even though that is, in a very literal sense of the term, a change in placement, if the program did not change substantially, well then that change in placement would not necessarily trigger the IDEA's due process hearings, because it would not be a change that is affecting the form of the educational instruction. It's just a change in the location at which that instruction is being provided. And again, the important take home here is that the program is, rendered, essentially is rendered unchanged in the process of this change in physical locations. When moving individual students, these kind of changes might not be considered a change in placement, again, if the new program is almost identical to the former one. So the big point of contestation here is if the student's educational, the student's program is going to be substantially changed based on this change of placement, and that student's educational performance might be negatively affected. In any situations in which changes in placement or changes in the location are rendering those overall programs as more restrictive for students, well, these generally constitute changes in placement. Except if changes in placement are happening because of disciplinary reasons. Well, in this situation, basically the rules are not so black and white. The textbook talks about graduation being an example of a change in placement, because graduation from high school effectively terminates all of the educational services that that student was receiving in that school district. So if a parent, believes that a school district allowed their child to graduate and that child was not, basically, ready to graduate, well, this change in placement argument could be invoked. Major changes to IEPs are examples of changes in placement, but again, minor adjustments may be considered allowable. And again, the important element is to evaluate whether the change in placement is going to likely affect a student's learning in some significant way. So that's essentially kind of the feature that the courts are really going to focus on. And there's going to need to be evidence provided in support of the change in placement, either A, affecting the student's learning, or B, the change in placement not affecting that student's learning in a significant way. Some students who are served by IEPs might receive auxiliary services that aren't necessarily called for in IEPs. So if a student is receiving these types of services, they can be changed without providing parents with the IDEA's due process procedural safeguards. So maybe a student is participating in a tutoring program, for example, and this tutoring program is not explicitly articulated in the student's IEP. Well, in those situations, changes in that service provision would not be protected. A parent could not contest them in the same way that they could a change in some service that is clearly and explicitly articulated in that student's IEP. And again, change in placement procedures are inapplicable to placements that are not made pursuant to its provisions. So if a student is being put in a program for, social purposes, for example, the IDEA's change in placement requirements cannot be invoked if the district attempts to transfer students to other facilities or otherwise removes them from residential facilities. Again, this is only applying to services that are explicitly specified in the IEP document. If it's no longer appropriate for a student to remain in a program they've attended, this is another situation in which these procedural safeguards will not be recognized. So if a school closes, or if the private school that a student is attending loses its state approval, if the program is found to be lacking in quality or a student ages out of a program, well, these are situations in which courts typically approve changes in placement, provided the change in placement is to a facility or a program that is similar to the one that, for example, closed or the student aged out of. And again, the key point here is that this new program is going to need to have the capacity to fully implement the student's IEP. Situations that lead to the altering of a school year. Textbook talks about this a little bit. These are not generally considered problematic as long as they impact all students equally. Students both in special education, and students who are also in general education. And the textbook provides an example of a situation in Hawaii in which, due to budgetary cuts, the school year was reduced. Basically, kids were given a number of Fridays off. In this situation, it was found, the courts ruled that a student, it did not count as a change in placement. And they basically argued that in applying IDEA's status quo provision in this situation would be essentially to give parents veto power over a state's authority regarding the management of its schools. So while parents do have a lot of say and rights in their students' educational programs, if changes in placement are in the form of administrative decisions that are affecting all schools in a district and all students in those schools, well, generally they will not apply. And just a final point for you all to think about when you're falling asleep tonight. Annual reviews are required. Reevaluations are required every 3 years, and parents certainly have the right to request reevaluations more frequently than every 3 years, provided there is a reasonable argument or justification for conducting these more frequent reevaluations. Okay, so a lot of information on the due process procedures for evaluation, IEP development, and changes in placement. Before we close, are there any questions?
Nope.
Slides will go up on Canvas. I'll put them up as soon as we sign off here. So if you want to revisit any of the information, it'll be there for you. But otherwise, thank you for a good discussion and hearing me out. And I will see you all tomorrow.
Have a good night.
All right, guys. You too. Bye-bye.